Welcome to a special edition of Stories with Brisco and Bradshaw. I am John Layfield, better known as Bradshaw, joined as always by my Hall of Fame partner, my Chickasha Hall of Famer, Mr. Gerald Brisco. And we have got our favorite archaeologist back. He is a fellow has been a fellow at the Society of Antiquaries in London, the editor for the British Archaeology magazine for 20 years, had an incredible book that we talked about earlier, How to Build Stonehenge. Mr.
Oh,
Mike Pitts, and now it's got a wonderful book out that we love to talk about because it's talking about ecocide and what is wrong about that, how archaeologists has gotten it basically wrong. And he is Mr. Mike Pitts, and this is his book, and it's fantastic. And we're glad our favorite archaeologist is back. Mike, thank you for coming back on.
I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for asking me on.
Mike, thank you so much. It's so cool when we talk to you about Stonehenge because you just went through things in a very pragmatic way. You've dug all over Stonehenge, you've done all over Great Britain, and you showed how it was built. And you're doing the same thing with Easter Island, dispelling a lot of myths. Was that the main reason that you wanted to write this book? Because you fell in love with Easter Island at a pretty young age,
I
right?
did. I did. Yeah. Yeah. I think both Stonehenge and Easter Island have a powerful fascination for me. And as you say, that it began at school when I discovered in the school library a book about Stonehenge and a book about Rapa Nui, about Easter Island, written by Tor Heyerdahl. And I really enjoyed both those books, but I never at that moment imagined that I would one day come to write my own books on both subjects. Still less that the writing of those books came from my own research and fieldwork, and particularly at Stonehenge. As you mentioned, I've directed excavations at Stonehenge. I've done a lot of research over the years at Stonehenge. Now, I haven't done anything as grand as that on Easter Island, but it was the visit there 30 years ago now that made me want to learn more about the island. And I have done some research in the British Museum, which has one of the statues taken away from the island. And we did some fantastic research into that statue. And I've done, in the course of writing this book, I did a lot of archive research in museums and libraries and uncovered a whole pile of news stories. And I don't claim to have any authority about Easter Island, but I do happily spin out new ideas and ask lots of questions about conventional things said about the island.
Yeah, Mike, talk about the study you did in 2012, I believe it was, in the British Museum about the
Yep,
Rapa Nui.
yep.
I know we got so many things to talk about. I don't want to just jump around chronologically, but if you don't mind, mention that study a little bit and about what you discovered, how you did it, and what your discoveries that you came out of that
Okay.
kind of led you
Yeah,
to where you are now.
yeah, yeah. It's actually, in a way, the study of this one statue lies behind a lot of the thinking in the whole book. So what happened was some friends of mine, I already mentioned that I've been involved with Stonehenge a lot, and several years ago, some friends of mine who were into very early software of digitization and images did a study at Stonehenge where we knew there were some very shallow carvings in some of the megaliths, which were really hard to see. And some friends of mine did a study of this, and we were able to see carvings that we couldn't see using um, digital technology. And I thought I'd always liked the statue in the British Museum. It's a wonderful piece of sculpture, and I just liked it for that reason alone, if none other, you know. And and it's unusual. In fact, it's unique as far as statues from the island are concerned, because the back of the statue is completely covered in shallow carvings, and they're quite difficult to read. They're worn. It's difficult to make sense of them. And I thought, maybe we could do what my friends did at Stonehenge. We could do with this statue. So I got in touch with them and said, "What do you think?" And they said, "Yeah, yeah, it could be done." He says, "But we're too busy with other stuff. We can't do it." And they put me on to somebody who was then at Southampton University, who was a great figure in James Miles in digital imaging. And we put together a team, and we had access to the statue at night. So we went into the gallery at night. There was just us and a man from the British Museum, make sure we didn't nick anything, you know. And it was the most extraordinary experience for me. I mean, being in the sort of semi-darkness of this huge gallery with this statue up on a plinth, And we spent a few hours with this statue, and James and his colleagues scanned it and also took photographic images. And so the two together, we were able to put together some really quite high resolution and detailed 3D digital models. And it worked because with those models, I was able to read these carvings on the back of the statue in a way that I'd never been able confidently to do before. And several people had tried to do this in the past, just from photographs. And I was never quite convinced by any of these readings. And what came out of that was, I think, for me, a convincing narrative of these engravings on the back. So first of all, if you imagine, you picture an Easter Island statue, you know, the great head with the ears down the side, arms close in, and hands coming across the bottom of a belly with this really distinctive, sharp, quite forbidding face. Now that's all of that is perfect in the British Museum statue, and because it's made of an unusually hard rock, it's particularly well preserved, so the features are very sharp. But if you go around the back, you've got all these confusing carvings, and these were clearly, and our study made this quite clear, added after the statue had originally been carved. And they show two facing sort of mythical imaginary creatures. They're sort of half human, half bird. They've got sort of like birds' heads with big beaks, and they've got human feet. And they haven't really got arms, and they're facing each other. And one of them has its closed beak sticking straight up in the air, and the other one has a closed beak facing the other bird. And it was those beaks that gave the clue to understanding this whole composition, because the beak coming in from the side has rounded, rather than pointed ends, you know, like the one going up. A typical bird has a pointed beak. It has a rounded end to its beak, and that rounded shape had been, in other contexts, been compared by archaeologists previously to engravings which are very common on rocks on the part of the island where this statue had originally been standing, to engravings representing the female sex. And I thought, right, what we've got here is we've got a male and a female bird man. This is some kind of mythical creature. And so you've got a pairing. And then above them, there's this little, looks like a fledgling, little birds shooting up. So that would be their offspring. And when you look at the rest of the back of the statue, there are what are traditionally and quite clearly male and female symbols. And we have female symbols on the side of the statue where the female bird is, and we have male symbols on the side of the statue where the male bird is. And so this is actually encapsulating a traditional island myth about the birth of a birdman, and a kind of god that was in the 19th century was known as Makemake. So it's a kind of, if you look at the statue, you start off with the traditional Rapa Nui statue. That is the big story on the island. But after Europeans first came to the island in the 18th century, things changed a lot. And one of the things that happens is that they appear by then to have ceased carving statues. That's why they did that. It's another story. But they really doubled down on these rituals around this statue and the carvings. And what we're seeing when they carve these bird men on the back of this statue, is a turning away from the statues, literally around the back, and highlighting of this newly energized ritual that I think is partly a response to the arrival of these extraordinary ships from nowhere that they had really, couldn't understand at first.
What was this a place where they were keeping basically a record? You're talking about this is in response to the ships coming in and the Europeans coming in. Was this a response to this, or was this kind of a second iteration of the Moai statue, a second generation add to it?
Well,
Was
in
it
a
just a
sense,
matter of convenience to be able to put it there as a record, is what I'm
yeah,
saying?
yeah. I mean, in a sense, it's both of that, because it's a kind of reinvention of traditional religious and political ceremonies and beliefs that were, I think we can safely say, centered around statues. for several centuries before the Europeans saw the island. And I think what they're doing is they're responding to the European visits. And in the 18th century, there are only four significant ones, and they're all quite benign. You know, they don't bring any diseases. They don't really steal anything. I mean, it starts, unfortunately, when perhaps as many as a dozen islanders are shot dead. So it's not totally innocent. But apart from that, there's nothing in it. It's not a colonial intervention, in the way that we traditionally think of these things. Each of the four expeditions that came to Rapa Nui in the 18th century, in the earlier 18th century, came from different countries in Europe, and they were all on voyages of exploration. They were looking for something other than Easter Island. They just happened to come across it, stopped there for supplies. And they left really detailed records that help us understand what was happening on the island at the time, which we can come on to. But I think if we try and look at it from the perspective of the islanders, these visits, which in total lasted less than a week, the ships were only there for a day or two at each of these four occasions. And if we look at it from the islanders' perspective, this is something utterly inexplicable. It's something quite extraordinary. They have been alone, more or less alone on this island, this small island, for centuries. There is nothing they can see from it except sea in all directions. As Thor Heyerdahl put it, I love this. He said that when you're on Easter Island, the nearest land you can see is the moon.
Wow!
And
wow!
so their world is this island. And as far as we know, archaeologically, there's no indication that once they'd settled in, that any other Polynesian visitors came to them. So they were on their own. Then suddenly, literally out of the blue, comes this Dutch ship, a couple of Dutch ships. And the ships are similar in scale to the original ocean voyaging Polynesian ships, which were double canoes, completely different type of construction, and had holds that were much less capacious than the European ships. But the scale of these ships is comparable. So they're ocean-going, voyaging ships. So they would have recognized, there would have been a kind of fellow feeling when they see ships. They know what a ship is, but it's quite unlike their own marine technology. The people on the ship, of course, are quite different physically, and everything about them, their clothes and their language, the food and drink and everything about them. And one of the things the islanders took a particular interest in were cannon, these great brass and iron guns on the ship. The whole thing's completely alien. So somehow they have to explain. This ship comes along, it's there for a day or two, disappears over the horizon, and then they go for a decade and see nothing else. They have to explain what's happened. And I think they can only explain this within their cosmology, their religion, and their mix of political, religious understanding of where they came from and where the world came from. They're not going to look at it in any kind of scientific sense, in the sense that we would look at it. And I think what they do is they respond in the same way that some Pacific Islanders did in the Second World War to the arrival of Japanese and American soldiers, when we saw things that we now call cargo cults, when islanders were suddenly inundated with kind of industrial wealth, with all these vans and ships and guns and soldiers with expensive kit and money and so on, sort of stuff they just were not used to seeing. And then suddenly they disappear. And so they then create this series of ceremonies, quasi-religious ceremonies, in which they attempt to invoke the return of these soldiers and these Americans and these Japanese and all the things that they brought with them.
Right.
And I think the same sort of thing is happening on Rapa Nui. So what they're doing with these birds is they're in a sense they're saying, we come back. We recognize, we understand who you are, where you came from. We'd like you to come back and bring us good things. So
what? And were the people at Rat Nui, were they shipping people too? I mean, most of their supplies were shallow water food and stuff like that. Did they do any research or any shipping or anything like that?
The islanders, well, they were living off a mixture of food that they grew on the island and seafood. And over the years they were there, if we get into the story of the islanders before 1722, when the first Dutch ships arrived, the starting point is to be clear that the island itself is a challenge. Aside from being remote, which itself is not helpful. So most Polynesian islands occur in archipelagos, in groups of islands, and some of them can be quite large. I mean, like the Big Island in Hawaii, for example, and islands in French Polynesia are really quite large islands, as well as all the little ones scattered about. And so there you've got a kind of quasi sort of continent of islands, if you like, and you can sail between these islands, and different communities can develop on different islands, and they can work with each other or against each other. Now, Rapa Nui is completely isolated, so there's just that one community. It's also a very small island, and there is a clear pattern among these thousands of islands across the Pacific, the Polynesian islands, that the smaller islands were more challenging for the early settlers. And the really small ones, it's quite common that people discovered them and settled, and for one reason or other, the communities failed. And there's archaeological research that has shown this, that sometimes when Europeans first saw an island, there was nobody living there, but archaeology shows that there were people, Polynesians there at one time, and those communities failed. Now, Rapa Nui is very much at the small end of the range of Polynesian islands, so its size and its isolation are against it, or against the communities that are trying to make a living there. But also it has other challenges. It's a little bit further south than many of the Polynesian islands. The climate's a bit cooler, the seas are a bit cooler, which kind of reduces the richness of the marine and the land ecology. And for example, on Rapa Nui, there are no breadfruit trees. Now, breadfruit's an absolutely key plant in much of Polynesia. It was used for carving figures, for example, analogous to the stone statues. And there's no pandanus, and pandanus leaves were stripped and woven into, and bark were woven into sails, and were used for these huge sails, these great ocean-going canoes. There was no pandanus on Rapa Nui. And the islanders themselves, as they traveled around the Pacific, they took with them all the plants and animals that they knew well and needed for farming and gardening. And many of those plants and animals failed to successfully take root or even get there. We don't know what happened, but they're not there on Rapa Nui. So, for example, an absolutely staple island across Polynesia is the pig. And in Melanesia and further west in the Pacific, there are no pigs on Rapa Nui. And so on and so on. But the islanders clearly knew that they had a challenge. They had an island with poor soils, poor ecology, not a single stream, not a river. Apparently, the Europeans were puzzled by this, apparently no fresh water. And but they knew that, these guys who arrive, this happens round about 1200 of Christian era. The people who discovered the island are among the world's greatest explorers and navigators ever. It's interesting that there was a theory very popular in the 19th and well into the 20th century among Europeans and North Americans, that there was a kind of, that the Pacific once had this huge continent on it that somehow blew up with some volcanic eruption or something like that, and all you got left with was lots of little islands. And so for Europeans, they found it hard to imagine people would discover all these little islands scattered across this huge ocean, mostly sea, of course. And so they imagined it was actually one vast continent. And of course, this was absolute nonsense. The Polynesians, for them, the sea, the ocean was the continent. The ocean was their home. They were so comfortable at sea that the sea was part of their world. And they were extraordinary competent navigators. They discover this little island. They arrive with all the skills that they have of exploiting these little islands and with bringing with them plants and animals. And they start gardening and farming. By the time the first Europeans arrived. And this is so important because this is by far the best record we currently have of actually what the Polynesians did with their home island. By the time the Europeans arrived, there are a few trees left. But the island is covered with highly productive gardens and fields. They've turned the island into a really productive, well-managed farm, in effect, using their traditional skills.
And that's with very little fresh water too, right?
Yeah, well, the fresh water, I mean, the rain's erratic. I mean, it does rain, but one of the things they seem to, they may carve little dishes in the rocks on the island to collect rain in temporary showers. But the main source of water, bizarrely, was actually in the sea. And what happened when it rained was the water just drained through the thin soils into the volcanic rock and permeated down to a water table. And the water table surfaces just offshore all around the island. And so they were able to go out into the sea and take fresh water from springs. This really puzzled some of the Europeans, because one of the things that happened later on was the Europeans brought sheep to the island, and the sheep would wander out into the sea. And so they built walls to stop the sheep getting out into the sea, which of course was, the sheep knew what they were doing. They were drinking the fresh water bubbling up from the ocean. But when these Europeans first arrived, the Dutch arrived, and the British, and there's a French expedition and a Spanish expedition. Now, the French expedition brought with it a gardener, somebody who really understood farming and soils, and he was sent by the French king to investigate Pacific Islands to see what their potential was for growing food that they could export and sell. So this guy, he comes to Rapa Nui, and unlike, or much more than any of the previous European visitors, he really understands what the islanders are doing with their land, and he is deeply impressed. He describes sophisticated gardening and farming techniques that are exactly the sort of things that at that very moment are being experimented with in Enlightenment Europe. So, for example, they're setting out their crops in lines, almost like you would see in a modern field. The French is a little bit ambiguous, but it's possible he's actually saying that they're using string to set out these lines. And they're doing things like banana trees. They're digging little pits to concentrate moisture around the roots of the banana plants. They have mulberry bushes, which are hugely important to them, because from the bark of these bushes, they make bark cloth. They make their clothes and fabrics. And around these mulberry bushes, to protect them from the sea spray and the wind, they build circular walls, and also to contain moisture. And I suspect there's also an element of kind of ritual there, that these are very special trees that are used for ritual products. They're weeding their fields, burning the weeds, and scattering them as ashes, as manure, fertilizer in the fields. I think that they're growing great fields of something the French scientists called solanum, which is a kind of type of plant like pepper and potato, but there's no apparent reason for this, because it's not a productive crop in terms of food or any other use. And it's used, occasionally it's used for dyes, across the Pacific, used for dyes or for making soup, but in really small quantities, whereas they're growing great fields of this stuff. And the French scientist says that one of the things they do is they leave fields fallow to recover between crops, and they grow different crops. So this is crop rotation. And I think with the solanum, what they're doing is they're actually growing green manure. So they're growing a crop to give the soil a rest, to improve its quality, and then they're digging it in as manure. Now, all these things and more are really sophisticated approaches to farming. They had somehow turned this island into this challenging island into a really productive landscape. It's the most extraordinary thing.
Mike, I lived in a remote island, but not near as remote as this. I lived in Bermuda for about 10 years, but we had Wi-Fi and
Well,
an
lucky
airplane
you.
and an airport, so it's not like we were had canoes to get there. But they had a pretty good underground aquifer. That's pretty much how, even since the
Yeah.
first shipwreck that got there, that
Right.
found that discovered the place, people settled there. That's how they got survived. Was the only springs that they had was these springs that were in the shallow salt water? Was there any on land? Was there any aquifer below the land itself?
They were the only springs. There were two ponds or two small lakes on the island, freshwater lakes, and they are inside volcanic craters, caldera. Um, there are no streams running into them. So the water in these comes purely from rain, and it gets pretty stagnant. And I'm doubtful that those were significant sources of fresh water for people. I don't think it would have been, the water would have been sour. I mean, for example, Captain Cook's, who led the British expedition that passed by Rapa Nui,
Mhm.
he describes his men. They were desperate for fresh water. They'd been at sea for months without seeing land, and they were developing scurvy. They were desperate for food, which the islanders happily gave them and fed them well. And they're desperate for fresh water. And they found, I think, one of these lakes and drank from it, and they're all ill. They all threw up, and they describe it as a sort of sulfurous pit. They compared it to springs in Harrogate in Yorkshire, and at the time they were very fashionable. It was a very fashionable spa town, and people would go to these springs, to these hot springs, for reasons of health. But they were highly sulfurous, and you definitely didn't drink that water.
Mike, I got to digress for just a minute because there's a great movie one time about Night at the Museum, and you're talking about going to the museum
Ah,
at night. With you're in there with all these British sarcophaguses and mummies and everything. Was it kind of cool to be in there? Was it kind of scary? What was it like being there? Did you have it all to yourself? That seems like an awesome experience.
it was. I can't. We were just in one gallery. You may imagine the British Museum is a huge place, and we were in a gallery that's actually it's sponsored by a health company or a charity trust called the Wellcome Trust, um, and it's illustrating themes of life and death around the world. So there's stuff from all over the world, choice exhibits um, in this big room, and the light was low. It's really still. And of course, during the day, the place is absolutely swarming with people. And in fact, it opens out onto the gift shop just behind. And of course, all that's closed down and it's still. And there was myself and three other archaeologists and a chap from the British Museum who helped make sure we didn't do anything we shouldn't do. And that was it. And it was, yes, it was extraordinary. I mean, it's a thing I never forget. We we,
That's
we spent
awesome.
2 evenings. We had two goes at it. We had quite a
Yeah.
lot of work to do with the statue, and it was very special. I'm kind of thinking, what can I do to get dream up a new research project so I can get to something like that again.
That's
It
awesome.
was absolutely fabulous.
Hey, and Mike, we want to get to that. There's the book, Island at the End of the
Okay,
World that you've
okay.
written. But a lot of this love started in 1994 when you got to spend a month
Mm.
in Easter Island. Is that when it really? Did you have a fascination before you went there, and then it grew, or did it start when you got there?
I did. I was fascinated by the place before. I mean, I'd read this book by Thor Heyerdahl when I was at school, and I absolutely loved the book. I mean, I loved the adventure, and Heyerdahl was a great storyteller. So there's a great pace to the book, and and that was written in the 1950s. So and he did some fantastic and still some of the best archaeological excavation on the island then. And I really enjoyed reading that. And I was already well into archaeology then, so I really enjoyed reading that. At the same time, there were things in the book that I thought, this can't be right. Either he's making this up or he's completely deluded. There was, and I that stayed with me through my archaeological career. And in the 1990s, I was privileged enough, just because of the way we'd set up our lives at the time, to spend most of the British winters in the tropics. And this particular winter, we were in the South Pacific, and we'd gone out to the Marquesas, which are a relatively remote group of islands, spectacularly beautiful, absolutely stunning. Unfortunately, when we found fairly rapidly that just living there as tourists, as casual visitors, was a really tough job. And we could see that not only was that not going to work out, but our money was going to run out. So we went back to Tahiti and plotted what we were going to do next. And the cheapest place and the nearest place to go to was Rapa Nui. Now, up to that point, I had, although the possibilities had long been there, I deliberately avoided going to Easter Island because I thought nothing can ever live up to my expectations, to my fantasies, my imagination of what it would be like to visit the island. But we were kind of forced into it. This is myself and my late former wife. And so we went to Rapa Nui and we were there for a month. And one of the, it started the moment I set foot on the island. It was raining when we arrived, so I couldn't see anything out the plane. You know, we came down on this little runway and down the steps of the plane. And there was no at that time, there was no building there as such. There was a little hut and a bit of a wire fence to keep you off the runway. And so I'm running across this runway, and there's this little knot of islanders at the edge, you know, waiting for relatives and friends to visit. And this woman is raising her arm up, waving her arm and shouting, "Mike, Mike." I thought, oh, there's somebody else on the plane called Mike. That's a surprise. It's got a small plane, and they're mostly Polynesians and French people. And it turned out she meant me. And it was like, what is this? You know, it was so bizarre. And it was later, and of course, what
elbow your wife and say, "I'm known everywhere."
It was like I was coming home. It was quite. I really hit. You know, it gave me quite a big emotional punch. And it turned out, of course, what happened. It had a logical explanation, of course. And what she was doing, she was touting for guests, for paying guests, because there weren't any hotels then. And we stayed with her family and had a really great reception and a good time there. And what had happened is that when we were in Tahiti, I'd met this Scandinavian captain of a container ship, and he was taking his ship back and forth across the Pacific, and he had a break, and he docked in Tahiti, and he was going to go and explore Chile for a bit, and he'd stopped over on Easter Island on the way. When we were in Tahiti, I gave him a book. You know, when you're traveling like this with a backpack, you carry books and you swap books and everything. What happened is he'd stayed with his family and left the book and told them about me. So when we arrived, they knew we were coming. But that was quite amusing. And then, you know, we were there for a month and I had the most amazing time, because of course what happened was that the reality exceeded my fantasy. It was, I don't think I'll ever experience anything like it. I was very lucky with the timing. Kevin Costner had been on the island the year before, filming a pretty dreadful, dire movie called Rapa Nui.
He's filmed some really great movies and some really bad movies.
He has. This was I would say this was probably the low point. I mean, it's a film watched occasionally by archaeologists now. But they'd been there. So the island had been taken over by this Hollywood machine the year before, which had kind of dented the tourism industry quite a bit, and schools had shut down, all kinds of stuff had happened, and so this was just, the island was just recovering after that, the year I was there, and it was just before the first paved road was built across the island, so it was most of the island was still relatively inaccessible, and all the people on all the islanders lived in this one town on one side of the island where there's a small bay. So, you know, I was able to go across the island. We had mountain bikes, so started off pedaling across the island, across these tracks. We had a tent in which we pitched at the statue quarries, and out on, you know, there's a single beach on the other side of the island from the town. And because it's so far from the town and there weren't any roads, there was nobody there on this lovely little beach, and we pitched our tent there, and we had a great time. And of course, for me, I had complete free access to visit all these amazing sites. And I shot rolls and rolls of Kodachrome. I'm a kind of keen amateur photographer. I took a lot of photographs, and I just had the time of my life.
Mike, you mentioned the
Mike, tell us.
Marquesas.
Go ahead, John.
Real quick, you mentioned the Marquesas Islands. I looked up the Rapa Nui, and I'm sorry, the Moai. There
Yeah.
isn't another place in the world. It appears that the Moai statues were built, except for maybe Marquesas had something kind of similar. What
Yeah.
is it about the Rapa Nui that built this? And is Marquesas, is that part of it? Is that something that came from a knowledge from Easter Island? Is that how it was shared?
The other way around. I mentioned that when Polynesians discovered Rapa Nui, they brought with them skills and materials to enable them to farm and garden on a really challenging island. And of course, they brought much more than that. They had a whole package of culture and beliefs and political histories and traditions and families and so on. And a big part of that was religion, which is, it's not something really separate from the rest of the world and society and their worldview. And commonly across the Pacific, New Zealand, Hawaii, Rapa Nui, the kind of three corners of this huge triangle across the Pacific, people carved figures, mostly out of wood. I mean, Hawaii, now, for example, I mean, there's a site in Hawaii, a royal site, where there's a bunch of relatively modern carvings that were put up when this site was restored. There's an exhibition in the British Museum at the moment about a fabulous expedition, I should say, if you happen to be traveling to London over the next few months, about connections between Hawaii and the United Kingdom. And there's a handful there of absolutely fantastic wooden carvings of these sort of mythical, godlike figures. So when Polynesians discovered their island, which we now know as Rapa Nui or Easter Island, they already had behind them a tradition of carving semi-human figures, which were representing, it varies, there's sometimes gods, sometimes ancestors or great human figures, chiefs and so on. And in islands closer to Rapa Nui, people were, before Rapa Nui was discovered, were carving some of these figures out of stone, and particularly the largest are in the Marquesas. And it was partly that actually attracted me to the Marquesas in the first place, to see some of these figures. And there are a few small stone figures on other islands that are not, the nearer islands to Rapa Nui. So Polynesians coming to Rapa Nui, they have a tradition of carving human-like figures in timber and in stone on the island over the years. There's a shortage of timber. And wonderful, miraculous thing, there is also on the island no shortage of stone. And the most important source of that stone is a small extinct volcano, heavily eroded, but there's a great ridge of rock on one side of the island beside a little crater lake. And that rock is really soft. You could almost scrape it with your fingernails. It's easier to carve than hard wood. And not only that, but it's in a sacred color, black, red and yellow especially, are sacred Polynesian colors. This volcanic rock, this soft rock, has a kind of yellowy brown color when it's fresh. And on the other side of the island, there's another fairly soft and particularly lightweight volcanic rock, which is pink, which is red. So they've got on this island these two types of rock in Polynesian sacred colors, one of which is, there's a lot of it, it's prolific, there's plenty of it, and it's really soft. So it seems like, to me, it wouldn't have taken them long to think, we can carve our figures out of this rock.
And Mike, these figures are really heavy, and I want to get to what you're talking about with the eco side with your book that's come out. But when you talk about them moving around, you had some theories about this that you thought that made, well, I think they made sense. I don't know about, I'm not going to speak for you, but you had some theories about how this was moved around, not necessarily by trees, but tell us what your thoughts are.
Oh, how they move the statues.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, statues. Yes.
Yeah. Well, there's been a lot in the news recently, hasn't there, about this theory that they were warped, a bit like fridges across a kitchen floor, that they were standing up on their flat bases, which they do have. They have these big flat bottoms. So when they stand up, these statues, they don't stick them in the ground. They stand them on a stone, sort of stone base on a circular disc, a fat disc, which is resting on top of a plinth made of a platform made of rubble paved with stone. So it's quite a complex construction to support these things, but they are balanced on their bottoms. And so the theory is that to move the statues, because there's so few trees on the island, so you don't, in other words, you don't need timber, you don't need to cut down trees to move statues this way, that the statues were carved and finished, and then they were stood up, and ropes were attached to the top of the head, and they were swung from side to side and edged forward like a monumental, like I say, like a you know, how you walk a heavy weight across the floor. And this has been done experimentally several times. In particular, there's a couple of archaeologists called Terry Hunt and Carl Lippo, and who have experimented with this, and I really recommend it. There's an absolutely fabulous video of this statue being walked. I think it's on Hawaii, along this track, and it really looks good, and it's convincing, it's spectacular, and I absolutely don't think it happened on Rapa Nui. You know, for a number of reasons. First of all, I mean, I think the original sort of idea behind this idea of walking statues like this is to argue that you don't need to cut down trees to move statues. And the reason for that is, and I think absolutely rightly, that Carl Lippo and Terry Hunt rejected the ecocide theory. They rejected the idea that islanders were so stupid that they cut down all the trees, they starved to death, and there were wars. So they then think, right, okay, to bolster our argument that they didn't cut down the trees, we will find a way of moving statues that you don't need those trees for. And this is a pretty convincing way of doing it, but I don't think it happened because, first of all, the experiments have all been on flat ground and smooth ground, and it works. But Rapa Nui's ground is anything but flat or smooth. It's hilly, it rolls, there are little slopes up and down, and it's really rough. Now you can clear away all the volcanic debris and you can flatten it and smooth it out. And indeed, islanders did build these paths, these ways, and sort of pave them and line them with little stone slabs that lead away from the quarries across the island. So on the face of it, it looks as if they're actually smoothing the ground so they can walk these statues along them. But again, I think they don't, you know, these paths are not entirely flat. They've got to go up and down. They're still got rough volcanic floor, these paths. And remember what I said about the rock these statues are carved from. It's really soft. I think the first experiment in which statues were walked in this way was done with a guy who got in touch with Torhado. And they actually walked one of the original statues on the island this way. And they had to abandon the experiment because chunks of rock were being split off the base of the statue. And I think these statues, they're not fridges, you know, these are highly emotive, potent, ritual, religious, political symbols of authority, of life, of power, all kinds of things. You're not going to risk having one of these things shatter. It's too important. If you're the person who commissioned the carving of a statue and have managed and arranged the group of people who are moving it, you do not want to lose face by seeing that statue lose chunks of rock and fall over onto its nose and possibly split across the neck, which it could easily do. And indeed, there are a number of fallen statues where the head has been detached from the body. So I think it's just unlikely that that's what happened. So that goes back to the question of how did they move them? And for me, that's not, it's a bit like Stonehenge. I said, well, you know, we'll never really know what they did at Stonehenge, but the one thing we do know is that they did it. You know, they found a way of doing it. And I think you don't need a lot of timber to move a statue. What basically you're doing is, I think what you need is a sledge. People often talk about pulling sledges and statues over rollers. Now you need quite a lot of timbers for rollers, but again, rollers don't work. They work like walking statues. They work when you've got ground that's perfectly flat, horizontal and smooth, and also when your rollers are perfectly tubular without any irregularities. But in all the experiments have been done, and many of these have been done with Stonehenge replica megaliths, people lose control of the stone and the rollers underneath because they go all over which ways. And so I don't think they're not using rollers in Rapa Nui. And all you need is a sledge, a couple of timbers really, and to tie this statue to it and then drag it with ropes, which they made from various plants that they're growing on the island. And one of the possibilities, I think, plants that could have been really useful in this context are the banana plants. Now, there are records of bananas being used in the far western Mediterranean to help launch canoes, where the soft stems and the foliage were laid down under the canoes. And actually, as the canoes, the weight of the canoes squashed the banana stems, then a lot of sap is released, and that actually lubricates the canoes. It moves over the ground and foliage that's been laid there. And I think so. So I think banana plants could well have contributed to the movement of statues. So that's, my approach to it. I think the one thing I'm pretty certain about is they weren't walked.
Right.
I think they were pulled on sledges in the same way that they use traditionally across the Pacific. They use sledges for pulling these massive, monumental ocean voyaging canoes. And I think, the canoes themselves, the ships, are in some ways analogous to the big statues. They're sacred constructions. They're constructions that involved huge numbers of people and a lot of skills, and they are hugely theatrical, the launching of the ships and the passage of these things, in the same way that carving the statues would have brought lots of people together, would have needed somebody to take some kind of control, and moving them, erecting them, and you end up with this absolutely monumentally impressive result.
Yeah.
Now, are there many statues that did make it to the resting place, or that are found along a pathway, or did all?
Yeah, I mean that again is debatable. I mean, the idea, the walking statue theory is partly predicated on the presence of a whole pile of statues that are halfway between the quarries and the coast where most of the statues were raised. And the idea is that these statues that are flat on the ground now were ones that, for one reason or another, were abandoned en route. And in the early days, the reason for abandoning them was that society, this is the ecocide theory, that the island society suddenly collapsed. And so there are all these statues that were in transit, that were making their way, and just suddenly everything stopped. And so you've got this kind of frozen landscape where you have statues in the quarries that are being made. You've got statues that are being finished off on the edge of the quarries. You've got statues lying on the ground that are on in transit, and you've got statues out on the coast that are just being put up. So you've got the whole scenario laid out before you. But that, is based on the assumption that society suddenly collapsed and everything suddenly stopped. And I don't think that there's absolutely no evidence for that. And as we heard when I was talking about the French scientist's description of the farming on the island, they had a really productive, healthy agricultural regime in place when the first Europeans arrived. There's absolutely no indication of war. There's no evidence of fighting whatsoever. By all accounts, the islanders were happy. So that sudden collapse didn't happen. So then we had to look for another explanation. And I think, and this is an idea that's been around almost as long as the collapse idea, that a much more convincing explanation is that all these statues that are at the quarry and that are beside the road this, fits the kind of in-transit theory, we're actually standing up there permanently. So they create these paths leading to and from the quarries that are kind of ritual processional ways. You imagine they're more for people than they are for moving statues. And they're standing statues up beside them. So there are these avenues of statues standing beside these ways, facing you as you walk, as you parade towards the quarries. And the quarries themselves had become monumentalized. It's like a miniature sacred mountain. And there are statues that are deliberately erected around the quarries. And indeed, these are the only statues that were still standing in the 19th century up to the present. Statues that are around the quarries. And the reason I think they're still standing is that close to the edge of the quarries, and the quarries are still active when these statues were raised, they gradually get buried in debris from further quarrying and soil that's falling down from the cliffs above. And so the bases of the statues are well buried, and there's nothing, you couldn't push them over, you need to excavate them to fell them. And so they survive standing up. And there's I can't remember the numbers, but there's 100 or so statues, I think, standing around and inside and outside the quarry.
Well, were these all created in the same time frame, or were they spread out over?
That's such a good question. I don't know. We don't know. There hasn't been excavation at the quarries that has produced any useful dating evidence. And to a lesser extent, that's actually true of statues all across the island. We're largely guessing. And that's not because archaeologists are incompetent. It's because it's an incredibly challenging thing to do. These monuments around the island are almost entirely built out of stone. And they are reworked and enlarged over generations, so that the monuments are complex. There are several platforms that are built and then collapse. New ones are built and extended. Statues are raised, fall over. New statues are brought to the site. And you've got really complex histories. And to really understand that history, you need to excavate an entire monument, which not only is logistically and financially an enormous challenge, but is also a challenge to traditional island values as well. You could justly be accused of interfering with sacred monuments. So this hasn't happened, and the resources have never been there. At the quarries, it's an easier job. I'm quite sure that with the right approach to it, it will be possible, and I'm sure this will happen one day, to get an idea of when some of these statues around the quarry were raised and how long it took for them to be buried in the way they have been. But that hasn't happened yet, so we're guessing.
Mike, I'm sorry, I didn't care. But do you think that these statues, there's two schools of thoughts on this. I don't know about two schools of thought, but people have different opinions on this. The statues were either buried by people or the sediment that came around and kind of buried itself. And I'm not sure if 800 years, if they can, 30 feet can cover that. What are your thoughts about, do you think that the people were burying these statues, or was it the sediment that just settled over time that ended up covering up a big part of the lower part of these statues?
I think it's a bit of both. It started off because what they're doing with these statues around the quarry, they're not putting these on plinths. They're sticking them in the ground. So they start off by digging a hole. Not a very deep hole, but they dig a hole and put the statue into that. Then once it's there, gradually then soil and rubble dribbles down from above and buries the bottom of the statue, fills it up. I don't think, there are drawings out there that show islanders digging great big deep pits in which they drop a complete statue and then finish it off before taking it off to the coast. I don't think that's happening. I think these really deep pits are created by soil and rubble falling down around the statues. They're not deliberately made, as it were. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons why I think that is if you look at all the descriptions of the statues that have been made over the centuries by visiting archaeologists, you can see it's really common for observers to make a distinction between statues at the quarry and beside the pathways on the one hand and statues on the coast on the other. The statues at the quarries, on average, there's a huge variety, but on average, the statues are significantly bigger at the quarries and the shapes are different. Now, if all those were destined to end up on the coast, we would see a bunch of different statues on the coast. The ones on the coast are all very similar to each other, and they're significantly smaller than the larger ones at the quarries. And the other issue is that all the plinths that we can now see around the coast, as far as we can tell, they've all got their full complement of statues. So if you've got 300 or 400 statues at the quarries waiting to go out to the coast, you have to ask yourself, where are they going to go? I think if you're carving a statue at the quarry and you're taking it out to the coast to raise on a plinth, you're not going to put all that effort into the statue. And that effort includes a lot of ceremony and social activity, and it's politically significant. This isn't just making a piece of artwork to sell at a gallery. You're not going to put all that effort into that statue, drag it out to the coast, and then think, now what are we going to do with it? Maybe we should build a plinth. Now, where can we put it? That, you know, the plinth is going to be part of that exercise. So the plinth is already going to be there, but there aren't empty plinths around the coast waiting for these hundreds of statues that are at the quarries. So there's a number of reasons, and those are the key ones where I think the statues at the quarries are meant to be there, and the statues beside the roads are meant to be there. And you've got this monumental complex on the eastern side of the island around these rock outcrops.
Yep. And Mike, in the book that you've got, one of the main things about you talk about is the fact that ecocide is kind of the popular narrative. You know, people love to use Easter Island as the example of what happens when society eats itself, essentially, and tears up its own resources. But your take on this, and which I reading the book, makes perfect sense, is that ecocide is the narrative that probably is not the correct narrative. It more has something more to do with probably the slave trade, but I'll let you go ahead and talk about it.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think it's interesting to see where the ecocide narrative arose. And it's been around almost since the first Europeans saw the island. So the narrative, the idea is that islanders got carried away making statues. They needed timber to move these statues and raise them up. And on this small island, there weren't a lot of trees, and they cut them down. And before long, there were no trees left, and the soils eroded. And so they had food shortages. And then the islanders started fighting each other. There were wars. And these wars between two groups across the island are testified to in island legends, supposedly. And they felt the society collapsed. And they started eating each other, you know, cannibalism, killing each other. And by the time Europeans first arrived, there was just a kind of a rocky desert with all these toppled statues. Now, it's really important in this story to distinguish between two different types of European visitor. In the 18th century, these first four big expeditions I mentioned earlier, they weren't looking for anything other than food and water and just to say hello and see what's there. They have bigger fish to fry elsewhere in the Pacific. And they're not damaging the island. I mean, notwithstanding this really unfortunate incident when a number of islanders were shot. And it's when islanders and Europeans panicked, basically. And of course, the Europeans have got guns and the islanders have got nothing. But aside from that, the damage to the island, it just isn't there. Now, all that changes in the later 19th century. And this happened almost overnight. In late 1862, early 1863, the island was assaulted by slave traders. That happened very briefly because it was already largely illegal selling slaves in the Pacific and on the South American continent. And what happened is these traders captured islanders, took them to Peru, and sold contracts rather than islanders. They found a bureaucratic way of getting around this, but they were soon rumbled. And eventually the Peruvian government was forced to clamp down on it. And they ordered surviving Pacific islanders. And this wasn't just Rapa Nui it affected many islands across the Eastern Pacific. They ordered islanders back home. Now, by then, these people, many of them had died, and many of them were ill. And it happened at the time this exodus from Peru occurred, there was an epidemic in the port, and they carried disease back to these islands. And more people died on the islands infected by these diseases than actually died during the slave trade. And by the time this is over, and this is only over a few months, half the population of Rapa Nui is dead.
Wow.
And they started off with around 5,000, I reckon, around 5,000 islanders. And then by an unfortunate chance of timing, we get the first missionaries, almost immediately, the first missionaries arrive on the island, and they have a more bad impact on the island. They set out, as missionaries do, they set out effectively to destroy the traditional culture of the islanders. They're not respecting the islanders. And they bring in more diseases. And then business people come in from Tahiti. And there's a particular guy called Dutroux-Bornier, who's a French crook, really, but he has an idea that the island would be great for sheep. And there's a market for mutton at the time and wool, good market. And he effectively turns the whole island into a sheep ranch. And to make this profitable, this works working with the missionaries who want the islanders rounded up into their mission so they can convert them and control them. They move all the islanders who have been living for centuries and generations in villages all around the island. They move the whole lot of them into this new town on the edge of the island. So all the traditional fields and gardens lie abandoned and covered with flocks of sheep and herds of cattle. And so the society is collapsing. There are two groups of missionaries who are also fighting each other. And so there are sort of actual real island wars involving Europeans on the island. And the mission in Tahiti advises Rapa Nui Islanders to flee the island and come to the safety of Tahiti, and several hundred do leave. And by the time we get to 1877, this population of 5,000 Rapa Nui Islanders has fallen to 110.
Wow.
I mean, it is the most appalling story.
And Mike, I pinched this off of a wonderful YouTube show that you did. You can see your picture in the top. It's a wonderful YouTube show. I recommend anybody try
okay.
it. That shows the sheep growth and the people decline right there, the graph. It's just
hold the graph. On that graph, the pink little mountain on the right, what's happening there is the blue is the human population. It grows steadily and reaches a peak of around 5,000. And then in the 1860s, you get the slave trade. And the population levels are quite well documented at that time. And it plummets the human population to almost nothing. But meanwhile, the pink rocket is sheep.
It's sheep.
So, but in the late 18th century, there are a few hundred islanders, and there are thousands, tens of thousands of sheep. And it's, again, an unfortunate accident of timing. It's at this very moment when the island is at its low point that the first visiting scientific expeditions arrive. And there are 6 of them. Most of them, one of them comes from Chile. One of them comes from the States, which is the last one. The USS Mohican comes in 1886, and the others come from European countries. And each of these expeditions, they're part of bigger projects. They're investigating the Pacific Ocean for political and commercial opportunities. But they have with them, as part of investigating the potential of the Pacific, they have with them a bunch of scientists. And they're all really interested in what's going on the island. And of course, they're particularly interested in the statues. And what happens when they get there, they see a grossly depopulated island. And in fact, this point in 1877, when the population hits that low of 110, is in the middle of these few years when these scientific expeditions arrive. So they see the island at its worst. And what there is of the population is living in this missionary town, and the island is otherwise completely abandoned and covered in sheep. So all the statues, of course, have fallen down. The houses have all gone. One of the things that the ranchers discover quite early on is if they burn the island vegetation, it's replaced with really good grazing grass. It freshens up the grass. Now, the houses are all made out of wood and plants and leaves. So all the traditional houses, the abandoned houses, they will have disappeared. They will have been burnt to a frazzle. And the gardens are all overgrown, and sheep and cattle will have devoured all the plants and so on. So these visiting scientific expeditions, they see an absolutely ravaged island, well, again, with no fresh water, makes it sound even worse, and yet covered with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of great fallen statues. And so they seek an explanation for this. And the first thing they do is they look for that explanation off island. They cannot believe that the islanders they see were responsible, excuse me, for creating all these statues. And so they look elsewhere. So we get these ideas of a lost Pacific continent. We get ideas that people might have come from India all the way across the Pacific Ocean to Rapa Nui, or from South America. In extreme cases, even from Europe, crossing the Atlantic and through the Americas to the Pacific. And the missionaries pick up on a legend of a war between two groups of islanders who are distinguished by their ears, and they're known as long ears and short ears. And this is a story that's first told in first recorded in the 19th century. And so that feeds into this ecocide idea. The islanders were at war with each other, and because they can see, there are just no fields, there's no food being grown on the island. So the islanders starved. It all makes sense, and so it all comes out of that. And then it was kind of turbocharged, if you like. It was reinforced in the 1970s and 80s when scientists discovered from pollen analysis that the island had once been covered in palm trees, completely covered in palm trees. So here was proof that islanders had removed all the trees. And this is where ultimately we come from when archaeologists are looking at this theory, this ecocide theory, which is originally propounded by archaeologists, but was picked up particularly by Gerald, who's a brilliant science writer, American science writer. And that kind of took it out to the rest of the world. I mean, for example, we have the idea of ecocide was quoted to as being quoted by two of our well-known prime ministers. First, Margaret Thatcher gave the example of Easter Island as a lesson to the world in a fantastic speech she gave to the United Nations. And Boris Johnson, who you may also have heard of, went on holiday on Easter Island quite recently, and he writes a newspaper column now. He's having to earn a bit on the side, and he wrote on in his column how Easter Islanders, they saw the Europeans and immediately dropped everything when they saw how superior Christianity was and gave everything up and knocked over all their statues. So it's an idea.
So we've learned kind of a couple of universal truths that we've always known. Politicians have no idea what they're talking about, and the church and the slave trade have ruined many civilizations.
Well, I mean, in a sense, the politicians were picking up on what was, in effect, a widely accepted scientific theory.
Correct.
And it's not a bonkers theory. It's not completely barking. So we're not talking, I mean, there are plenty of theories out there about Rapa Nui which are completely insane, that the statues were carved by aliens and so on. And, there are plenty of films you can see on the History Channel now that talk about flooded continents and invaders from space and so on. We're not talking about that sort of nonsense. This is scientifically justifiable. But what I'm saying is, and what Terry Hunt and Carl Lippo said, and this is so important because when archaeologists actually investigated all these claims, they completely fell apart. So there's no evidence for war. There's no evidence that for starvation, and so on and so on. And so what I'm saying is that ecocide is a logical theory, but the evidence isn't there on the one hand. And on the other hand, and particularly when we look at these early European visiting records of how they were farming on the island, that actually the evidence is the opposite. The islanders arrived to find this really challenging, ecologically challenging small island, and they did really well. So what they did, obviously you've got to cut down trees to grow food. You're turning forest into productive agricultural garden land. And actually what they did from a human perspective, they increased the ecological variety and the productivity of the island.
And one other thing, Mike, that you kind of brought back was Kathleen Rutledge. I believe I'm saying her name right. Was a little bit discredited, maybe because of the way she passed away. She had some mental issues later in her life, ended up in some places and didn't have a great ending. But you brought her back, and that's a big part of your book, right?
The story of Kathleen Rutledge is extraordinary. I mean, it's one of the great travel adventures of the last century. Indeed, it outdoes, I think, it outdoes Tor Heyerdahl's adventures on Rapa Nui. And it was a couple, Catherine and her husband Scoresby, and they went out to Easter Island. They left Britain on a ship that they had built specially for them, a wooden ship, and they sailed it across the Atlantic and around the bottom of South America and out to Rapa Nui. And they got there in early 1914, and they were there. They planned to go for 6 months, but they were there for nearly 17 months, and they were delayed by two things. The first was, not long after they arrived, there was a revolution on the island, and I suspect partly inspired by their presence, when a visionary woman led a revolt and staked a claim for the islanders owning the island. By then it had been claimed by Chile. And that sort of that endangered their lives, the Routledge's lives, and hundreds of cattle were slaughtered. And the Hangaroa, the village, the town, became a kind of open slaughterhouse. And there were guns being passed around, and it was altogether quite a scary episode for the Routledges, not the sort of thing they were used to in their lives. And that delayed their research. And barely had that finished than the German Pacific War Fleet arrived off the island. They didn't realize what was happening at the time, but back in Europe, the First World War had broken out. And that fleet was there for a week and then left. And there were some absolutely iconic German ships there, like the Scharnhorst and the Dresden. And a bunch of these ships were later sunk in battle with British fleets, and tens of thousands of lives were lost. A major marine battle of the First World War. Of course, the Routledge didn't know that happened at the time, but this affected them more than that week's visit, because their own boat, which they'd christened the Mana, was traveling backwards and forwards across the Pacific between Chile and the island to pick up supplies. And when the German fleet arrived, and I think this was probably fortuitous for them, the Mana was in Chile. I think there's a real danger that if the ship had been there, the Germans would have taken it or destroyed it. And so when the German fleet left, Scoresby thought he should go to Chile to make sure that the Mana was safe. And he went across on the first ship that arrived on the island. And when he got to Chile, he got stuck because the authorities wouldn't let him leave the harbour. And one of the German ships that they'd seen on the island arrived in the harbour as well. So he had to lie low. And so he was stuck out there for 3 months. And that left Catherine and one other member of the expedition, who was the cook, who one of the other skills was that he had skills with a rifle, which were quite useful at the time. And he left just Catherine and this guy she calls Bailey. We don't know any other name for him. And they seem to have got on very well. Just left the two of them on the island for 3 months. And during that time, Catherine did the most fantastic research. She got to know the islanders. By then, through the revolution, they had engaged with the islanders in a way that they hadn't anticipated. And they'd come to realize that the islanders had history, had rights, had agency over their land and themselves and their future. And Catherine spent these 3 months, rather than digging up more statues, which they'd been doing before, she spent most of that time talking to islanders, learning their language, writing down all the stories they could tell them. She collected huge lists of names for places around the island, names for statues, legends and stories, vocabularies and so on, and accumulated a huge wealth of island legend and knowledge. And eventually, Scoresby was able to get back to the island, and then they stayed for several more months, did some more excavations. So by the time they finished, they were nearly 17 months there. They had they'd planned to visit other islands in the Pacific on this expedition in search of the origins of the Rapa Nui. But by then they had to get back to Britain. Back in Britain, Catherine and Scoresby put a lot of effort into telling everybody about what they'd learned, which was, there'd been nothing like this before on the island. I mean, the longest stay on the island by any visitors before had been 13 days which was, as it happens, the American expedition in 1886, the Mohican. And 13 days, I mean, they exceeded that. There were more months in their expedition than there were days in the previous longest stay. So they had a huge amount of new information about the island. And people were understandably eager to hear it. And they gave lots of lectures. They wrote lots of magazine. They wrote a feature for National Geographic magazine. They wrote articles for newspapers. And they gave talks to scientific conferences and so on. Catherine wrote a fabulous book, which is kind of half ethnography, anthropology, archaeology, half travelogue. And they wrote, and she wrote in particular, there were a number of technical scientific papers, so a fantastic amount of stuff. However, her vision for the island, which was that it was entirely Polynesian, she wasn't convinced by these legends about wars and so on. And she had, she had an understanding of the islanders as people, which was completely new. But that didn't go down well with the anthropologists and the scientists, and the people that listened to her in Oxford and in various other places, and she'd studied at Oxford, and so she had professors who knew her well in Oxford, and they listened to her talks and so on. But many of them had all themselves done research in the Pacific, but on the other side of the ocean with Melanesian people rather than Polynesian people. And they were convinced that there were two people like these legends that the missionaries liked to promote on the island, and they were Melanesians and Polynesians, and there were wars between them. And Catherine couldn't convince them otherwise. They weren't really listening to her. And so what they did, she and her husband decided to go back out to the Pacific and fulfill the second part of their original program and to visit other islands. And they spent another couple of years traveling around the Pacific, mainly in French Polynesia. They spent over a year on one island, Mangareva. And by then things were starting to go wrong. Their marriage was starting to fall apart. Catherine was showing early signs of mental illness. And back in England, it all went peep-tong, it all collapsed. And she bought this mansion for one of the most luxurious residences in London. And very shortly, she locked Scoresby out of it, threw all his belongings in the street. And he went off to live in lodgings. And she gradually sort of showed real signs, I think, of mental illness. She told people she was being poisoned, that she was in fear of being attacked. And she wrote letters to relatives and talked to journalists and complained that she was being treated in the way she was because she was female, which sounds plausible, and the press had a fairly positive view of her. And poor old Scoresby, I think, got a rather bad rap of it. And but I think she was genuinely ill. And eventually what happened is Scoresby just lost patience and arranged for an order to be produced that allowed him to break into her house. And he did that with some police and some doctors. And they kidnapped her, bundled into a car, drove her across the country, and dropped her off at a mental asylum where she spent the final years of her life and died. And she had planned to write books, to write up her research. They had 3 or 4 tin trunkfuls of documents, of diaries, notebooks, plans, surveys, photographs, and so on, of their researches on Rapa Nui and from the second expedition with the other islands. And she'd planned to write all this up and publish it, but it never happened. When she died and they open up her will, they discover, amongst other things, that she'd left money for somebody else to do this research. And in modern terms, it's the equivalent of nearly $250,000. I mean, a significant sum for any research project. If you had that today, I mean, it was effectively the work of a doctoral thesis, 3 years research. One person could probably have done it. And Scoresby was one of the trustees for the will. And the will mentioned not just the money, but she also says that she would like the research to be managed by the British Museum or the Royal Anthropological Institute, another London institution. And when the research was finished, all the records would be given to whoever did the work. And logically, it would be the British Museum, because Scoresby had always described the expedition as the Easter Island expedition on behalf of the British Museum, and they gave huge numbers of archaeological artifacts to the British Museum. So it would be perfectly logical for their research notes and field notes to end up in the British Museum as well, and would have been absolutely wonderful. Unfortunately, that never happened. And I say in the book, I think this is one of the most shameful episodes in British museum archaeology, that those records did not go to the British Museum or indeed the Royal Anthropological Institute, where they would be accessible to everybody from the moment Catherine, or within a few years of Catherine's death. If that had happened, it would have transformed our understanding, I think, not just of Rapa Nui, but elsewhere in the Pacific of Polynesian history and ethnography, not least because on her second expedition, one of the things we know she did was she recorded a lot of legends, legends in Mangareva, and wrote them down. And the difference between Mangareva and Rapa Nui is that Mangareva never suffered in the way that Rapa Nui did. Its population wasn't nearly annihilated by slave traders and missionaries and so on. There's a much stronger continuity of tradition and belief in Mangareva. So the traditions and legends that Catherine recorded there are much more relevant to Mangarevan deep history than the legends that were recorded in Rapa Nui, because we need to remember that the Rapa Nui legends were all recorded after this massive population collapse. And at the time the missionaries recorded these legends, the population was growing fast by people coming in from outside the island. Now, most of those were Polynesians, but they were coming from islands with different traditions who didn't know Polynesia, who didn't know Rapa Nui. And there were also Europeans and South Americans coming in. And so these legends were kind of being created anew in a very inventive and powerful way, but they weren't necessarily totally, we can't assume, legends that would have been known to Rapa Nui people before Europeans first arrived.
Right.
Whereas in Mangareva, we've got every reason to think that actually would be the case. So those things, those stories are particularly precious. Now, anthropologists today know those records were made by Catherine, but they still haven't been able to find them.
Right.
And what happened is that Scoresby effectively shut down on the whole thing. First of all, he delayed any access that anybody had, any discussion about these documents. And when the time came, he didn't talk to the British Museum, who would have, I think, appreciated much more the significance of these documents than the Royal Anthropological Institute, which up to that time barely knew of any of their fieldwork in the Pacific. So they didn't know that there are all these artifacts in the British Museum and in other museums that they'd given them to. They didn't know that most of their Easter Island documents were already with the Royal Geographical Society, where Scoresby had loaned them. All they knew was what Scoresby chose to tell them. And all he told them was that there were 2 notebooks from Mangareva. He didn't mention stuff from Rapa Nui. And most of the argument over the will and how this money was going to be spent was in sort of legal bureaucracy stuff, and it just and it fizzled out, and Scoresby got ill and lost his patience and progressively claimed that it was his right to do this and to have all these things. And in the end, everybody just gave up, and there was a huge legal bill for no effect, and all the documents just disappeared with Scoresby, and that was it. And
what a wasted opportunity.
It's so sad. I mean, I think what happened is Scoresby, he was ill. He was in his 70s.
Yeah.
And I should say, I haven't mentioned this, that when they went to Rapa Nui, they were both, I mean, Catherine was nearly, and Scoresby was just over 50. They weren't young when they started on all this. It was an extraordinary thing they did.
Yeah.
But I think what happened is Scoresby had just lost patience with the whole thing. He got frustrated with Catherine's mental illness and the problems that had brought him. And he just didn't want to lose control of these records and all these photographs. Somehow he couldn't bring himself to give it up to a bunch of scientists.
Right.
And what he did was, after Catherine died and this was sorted out, he moved to Cyprus in the Mediterranean. He took much of the stuff with him. And I think he just went out there and lived with his memories of the Pacific, and that, fortunately, through people out there and friends of the family and so on, that material was ultimately given to the Royal Geographical Society. So we've got we've got most of the Rapa Nui stuff. But what he didn't take with him was the stuff that came from Catherine's researchers on their second expedition. And over the past decade or so, that has been sold in a number of different lots at auction and is now in private hands. One large chunk of it, I think, is in a known private collection in the States. Where the rest of it is, I have no idea. We don't know, and none of this has been examined. But the potential is there, you know. And it's the same with the stuff that's in the Royal Geographical Society. Scoresby didn't tell anybody he'd done this, that he'd given them all Catherine's record, well, indeed his as well, a lot of his work, to the Royal Geographical Society. And they were only discovered by archaeologists in the 1970s, and they still haven't been fully researched and used, and there's massive potential there. So it's actually, the future is quite exciting, although the past is rather tragic.
Right. Mike, Mr. Brisco and I, we've kept you forever, and thank you so much for your time. But we love what you've written. We love you. We love talking to you, but we're just a couple old wrestlers. We don't count. How has your book been received since you've had it out? Go ahead.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, John. It's really, I mean, we've had some fabulous reviews, and not least in the States, because the book the cover that you've been showing is the book as it's published here in Britain, and we've had some lovely reviews here. But it's coming out in the States on January the 27th. I'll show you. It looks like this. It has a different cover.
Yep. And we'll put that up several times in post edit. We'll put that up for you.
I won't say which cover I prefer, but I do like this one.
And Amazon and the usual book places.
And we've had. I mean, what I really like is I think that people are using words. You know, I think people are captivated by the story in the same way that I was. You know, it is such an extraordinary story, and it's so full of tragedy and triumph and creativity. I mean, I think at the heart of it is this little island that a few thousand Polynesian islanders turned into this monumental sculptural representation, the whole island representation of their world, and their idea of existence and creation. And there's nothing quite like that, really. It's happened anywhere else. I think it was just magnificent. And the story of how that happened, and then the tragic story of what followed, I think is just fascinating.
Mike, what's next? Do you have anything else in the pipeline? This is enough. I know that, but what's next? Well, we're living vicariously through you, by the way. We love
and we can't wait.
Okay, well, I mean, I can't say it's in the pipeline. I mean, but I have an idea for a book, and funny enough, it's another book that I've had at the back of my mind in some way since I was at school. So this would be kind of like the third, if you like, of these stories. But it would be the most challenging thing I've written, and I've got a lot of research, and I'm not going to tempt fate by saying what it is yet. But yeah, I definitely.
But we will be one of the first to know when you do, right?
Oh yeah, we'll be in touch.
Well, Mike, we've taken a ton of your time, and you've been so generous. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us, and look forward to whatever is next. We look forward to it. We're your biggest fans.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike.